Chapter 4. The Arrival of Brown. The journey to the coast went quickly, and we said goodbye. "When shall we meet again, I wonder?" he said. "Never, unless you come out," I answered, not looking at him. "Goodbye, then," he said. "Perhaps it is for the best." We shook hands, and I walked away to my boat. As I walked, he said one last thing. "Tell them—" But he didn't finish. By that time the sun had set, and to the east it was getting dark, the coast turning black. The western horizon was like a great fire, gold and red in colour. I watched Jim getting smaller and smaller on the beach as the ship I was on slowly sailed away. At first he seemed no bigger than a child, then only a white dot that shone brightly in a world of darkness, and suddenly I lost him. After this goodbye, my information about Jim was like a puzzle, but I've managed to fit it together. It is the saddest thing that I shall never hear his voice again, nor see his face. The story begins with the extraordinary adventure of a man called Brown. Until I discovered this man in a dirty hut in Bangkok, my information was incomplete. Luckily, he was happy to talk to me about his meeting with Jim, despite the fact that he was a dying man when we met. The story shows Cornelius to be surprisingly sly and clever. I could see as soon as I met him what sort of man he was, said the dying Brown. A man. He hadn't devil enough in him to kill me when he could. Well, I ended his life after all. I shall die easier now. He laughed, but the laughs soon turned into coughs. I felt sick to look at him with his yellow eyes and long untidy beard. While he told me his story, he would look at me nervously, worried. He thought I might get bored and leave before he had a chance to finish. He died that very night, but by that time I had nothing more to learn from him. 8 months before this, I had gone to visit Stein. At the door to his house I met a Malay I recognized. It was Tam Itam. I thought that perhaps Jim had come to say. "Is Tuan Jim inside?" I asked. "No," he replied. "He would not fight. He would not fight," he repeated. I went into the room and saw Stein. "What's the matter?" I asked him. "Come and see the girl. She is here," he said. "Tell her to forgive him. She won't listen to me, but you know her. Perhaps you can help." I walked through Stein's big house and found the girl sitting at a big wooden table on which she rested her head, hiding her face with her arms. She looked up when she heard me and watched my approach. "He has left me," she said quietly. "It would have been easier to die with him. He is just like the other white men." "He wasn't like the others," I told her. "He was false." She said, No. Stein interrupted. "Not false. You don't understand." Her anger towards Jim made me feel sad. I left them that same afternoon. As I said, the story begins with Brown. For some 20 years he was the terror of the Far East. He would steal, rob and kidnap, and was known for his arrogance and bad temper. But one day, it seems his luck came to an end. His bad luck started when he ran away with the wife of a missionary working in the Far East. It was a dark story. She had been ill when he took her onto his boat, and she died soon after. It is said that Brown was heartbroken and miserable for months afterwards. It was soon after this that Brown and Jim had met. As I said, Brown had been a pirate for 20 years. He was tired of life and not afraid of death. The only thing that scared him was prison. One day his ship had been stopped by a Spanish Navy boat, which found that Brown had been smuggling guns. Brown was taken to a Spanish colony and held there, where everything was taken from him, his money, even the ship's sails. Escape seemed impossible. Luckily, a beautiful Spanish ship was being kept in the same bay where Brown's ship was. So on the second night of their captivity, Brown and his men escaped, stealing the ship, and sailed away to safety. But the safety was only an illusion, because in a stolen Spanish ship it was impossible to enter any ports as they had no papers, no money, and no lie believable enough to explain why they had the ship. They sailed through the Java Sea hungry and hunted. Brown hoped to get to Madagascar, to then sell his new ship. However, before he could sail across the Indian Ocean, he would have to get enough food and water. And so, Brown arrived at Batu Kring, only a pistol shot away from the fishing village Jim had arrived at some 2 years previously. He and his crew of 14 pirates got into one of the smaller boats and sailed up the river, hoping to find food, water, and perhaps even some gold. However, the headman of the fishing village at Batu Kring was able to send a warning up the river about the new arrivals. When Brown entered Patusan, the men of the town began firing their guns at him, to which Brown's men replied with quick but wild shooting. Brown became full of anger and hate against the people who had attacked him. He looked for an escape, and so he entered a narrow river that took him away from his enemies. Not long after, Brown found himself on top of a hill, about 900 meters from the village, where he left his boat by the river and waited for an attack. That night, big fires were lit all around the Patusan, and it was clear to see from where Brown was that it was a huge place. His men lay in silence. During the night, neither a shot nor a shout was heard. Around the hill, all was dark. It was as if they were dead already. During this time, Jim had been away for more than a week, and it had been Dane Warris who had led the attack. That brave and intelligent young man had wanted to finish the invaders that night, but his people didn't believe in him, for he didn't have Jim's reputation of supernatural powers. He was one of them, while Jim was one of us. Moreover, the white man was a tower of strength and immortal, while Dane Warris could be killed. Chapter 5. Many Meetings. That night there was a meeting which all the headmen went to. In this, Dane Warris advised that the invaders should be attacked immediately, but it was Doramin who decided against this. He pointed out that the men could stay on their hill and die of hunger, or they would try to get to their boat and be shot by the men from the forest. These strangers were defenceless and could be killed without the risk of a battle. Dane Warris was ordered by Doramin to go 10 miles down the river and camp there in case the white men tried to escape. In my opinion, this was done to protect his son, because his bravery would put him in great danger if he was near the attackers. The Raja's representative at these talks was a man called Kasim. He told the group that he himself would try to make contact with the white men, but he had a little plan of his own. He went and found Cornelius and gave him the job of interpreter. The next day, Brown heard a voice from the top of his hill, in English, ask for permission to speak to the men. Brown was very happy about this, as he no longer felt hunted like a wild animal. Half an hour's talk with Cornelius opened Brown's eyes to the events and politics of Patusan. But before he would talk about any plans for peace, he told Cornelius that he wanted food to be sent to him, as a sign of good faith. Later, Cornelius returned to the hill with Kasim. Kasim hated Doramin and the Bugis, but he hated Jim even more and saw this as a way to end the white man's power forever. He told Brown that he and his men should fight for the Raja, and if they did so, they would be given their freedom. Brown agreed with this diplomacy, but only to give himself time, as to him it seemed the best person to do business with would be the white man. They could work together to take control of the island, and then one day, after some argument, Brown would kill Jim and become king. Later that day, Brown saw a man on the other side of the river, about 200 meters away. Brown decided that he would teach these people a lesson, and called for one of his men, a Yankee, who was an excellent shot. The man dropped to one knee, aimed, and fired. He immediately stood up to look. The man fell to the ground and didn't move. Brown told me later that this had put the fear of instant death into these people. That night, all was quiet on top of Brown's hill, but from the village came a loud tremor, like hundreds of feet stamping and noise of many voices. It was then Brown confessed that he thought he had finally met his end. It seemed there would be no chance for escape. Then one of the whites remembered he had left some tobacco in the boat and told the men he would go and get it. Brown let him, thinking there was no danger. A moment later the man was climbing into the boat and then out again. "I've got it," he cried. Then, with no warning, there was a sudden flash from close to the boat. "I am hit!" cried the man. Instantly all the men started firing in the direction of the shot. After much panic and noise, Brown managed to stop the firing. Then a strong voice was heard close to the hill, speaking in the native language. This was followed by the English, translated by Cornelius. "Do you hear on the hill?" "Speak," shouted Brown. The voice continued. "Between the men of the Bugis and the white men on the hill there will be no faith, no speech, no compassion, no peace." The wounded man continued to moan during the night. Sometimes the cries were loud, sometimes almost whispers. He was a strong man and died hard. Never for a moment did the noises from him stop. Brown and his men had to listen to their comrade for a full 6 hours, until finally the tide came in and the river silenced him. Soon after this, there was a great shout from the village, and a big drum began to beat. "He has come," said Cornelius. "What is all that noise for?" asked Brown. "For joy," replied Cornelius. "He is a very great man. He will come and talk to you, but he is a fool. He is not afraid of anything. And then, Captain, you tell that man of yours with the rifle to shoot him, kill him, and all the others will do anything you want them to do." Brown looked at his men. They were cold, tired, and scared. But he still wished for one more chance, for some other grave. That day, Jim and Brown met each other. Brown hated Jim at first sight. Whatever hopes he had of working with Jim disappeared immediately. He hated the other man's youth and confidence. They met across the river, and for some time they stood looking at each other. "Who are you?" asked Jim at last. "My name's Brown. What's yours?" Jim paused and then continued his questions. "What made you come here?" "That's easy," Brown replied bitterly. "Hunger." "And what made you?" Brown told me later that Jim had gone very red in the face, as he did not like in any way being asked questions. He was too big and powerful for that. "We don't ask for anything, but to be given a clear fight or a clear road back from where we came." "Why don't you tell me about your life?" he asked. "No? Well, I'm sure I don't want to hear it anyway. I know it's no better than mine. You talk as if you were one of those people that should have wings, so as to go about without touching the dirty earth." Brown told me he had asked Jim many questions about his life and tried to persuade him that they were the same. At last he threw himself on the ground and watched Jim out of the corners of his eyes. Jim stood on the side of the river thinking. Finally he spoke. "Will you promise to leave this place and give me your weapons?" "You think I am crazy," Brown replied. "I am to get to Madagascar with no money, just the ship I have and the clothes on my back?" "Oh no, we are going to keep our guns." "Very well," said Jim. "You will either have a clear road or a clear fight." Jim walked away, and they never saw each other again. On his way back to the hill, Brown met Cornelius. "Why didn't you kill him?" he asked unhappily. "Because I can do better than that," Brown said with amusement. Chapter 6. Betrayal. Jim returned to the village to speak with the leaders. There was great anxiety in the village. People said it was worse than in Sheriff Ali's war, as then many people didn't care. Now everybody had something to lose. The chief sat side by side, with Jules standing by Jim, as he informed them that the white men were waiting for a reply. They were men who had suffered greatly from hunger, and this made them blind to right and wrong. He advised that the men should be allowed to leave the land. "Have my words ever brought suffering to the people?" he asked. He turned to Doramin, who raised his head and gave his permission. The others each gave their opinion. "It is best, let them go," and so on. Most of them simply said, "Believe in Tuan Jim." After this, Jim told Jewel she'd be in command of the fort for another night. "There's no sleep for us, old girl," he said, "while our people are in danger." Later on, he said jokingly that she was the best man of them all. If you and Dane Warris had done what you wanted, no one of these poor devils would be alive. "Are they very bad?" she asked. "Men act badly sometimes without being much worse than others," he replied. The night was clear, but without a moon, and the middle of the river was dark, while the water under each bank reflected the light of many fires, as on a night of Ramadan, Tam-e-Tam told me. Earlier in the evening, Brown had received from Jim a folded piece of paper on which was written, "You get the clear road. Start as soon as your boat floats in the morning tide. Let your men be careful. The bushes on both sides of the river are full of well-armed men. You would have no chance, but I don't believe you want bloodshed." He ripped up the note, and turning to Cornelius said, "Goodbye, my excellent friend." Cornelius didn't go away after he had delivered the message. "You didn't kill him, and look what you've received, nothing," he said angrily. "You had better clear out of here," growled Brown, without even looking at him. But Cornelius began to whisper very fast, touching Brown's elbow from time to time. What he had to say made Brown sit up. He had simply informed him of Dane Warris's armed party down the river. At first, Brown saw himself completely betrayed, but a moment's reflection convinced him that there could be nothing bad intended. "And the leader of the men who are waiting for you down the river is the same man who led the attack on you when you first arrived," Cornelius told him. "It would be better to avoid such a man," said Brown. "I know another way to approach the camp," said Cornelius. "You will have to be quiet, though," he said. "Oh, we know how to be quiet as mice," said Brown. It was 2 hours before dawn when the white men got into their boat. As they sailed down the river, Brown, leading his men, heard Jim speak calmly. "A clear road. You should trust the river while the mist is clearing, but it will have gone soon." "Yes, it shall be clear soon," replied Brown. After a time, Cornelius came to Brown, and without a word he took over from him. The forest covered them in darkness, like enormous black wings. Tam-e-Tam was then sent by Jim to give a message to Dane Warris. On arriving at the camp, he immediately found him and began by handing him the ring. "The news is good. The white men are leaving, and they are allowed to pass here." After this good news, Dane Warris lay down and waited for his food to cook. The sun was eating up the early morning mist. It was then that Brown took his cold-blooded revenge. He quietly approached the camp, led by Cornelius, who was being forced to guide the men. Brown walked behind him, and from time to time gave him a violent push. Cornelius remained as quiet as a fish. The men surrounded the camp, and when he thought the moment was right, Brown yelled, "Let them have it!" and 14 shots were fired all at once. Tam-e-Tam told me that the surprise was so great that except for those who fell dead or wounded, not one of them moved for quite a long time after the first shots. Then a man screamed, and most of the men panicked. A few jumped into the river then, but most of them did so only after the last shots. 3 times Brown's men fired into the crowd, with Brown shouting like a madman, "Aim low! Aim low!" Tam-e-Tam fell down and lay there playing dead, but with his eyes open. At the sounds of the first shots, Dane Warris jumped up and ran outside, just in time to receive a bullet in his forehead during the second shot. Afterwards, the whites left, and they seemed to vanish from the world as well. Their ship, too, vanished. But a story is told of a white longboat picked up a month later in the Indian Ocean by a cargo ship. There were 3 yellow, glassy-eyed skeletons on her, one of whom declared that his name was Brown. His previous ship, he reported, had sunk. He and his companions were the survivors of a crew of 6. 2 died on board the ship which had rescued them, but Brown, of course, lived to be seen by me. It seemed, however, that in going away they hadn't given Cornelius's canoe back to him. Brown had let him go, with a kick as a thank you, at the beginning of the shooting. Tam-Itam saw Cornelius running up and down the shore of the river. He was looking for a canoe to take him back to the village, but, despite his frantic efforts, all of the boats were too heavy for him to move. Until he saw Tam-Itam, he stood looking at the heavy canoe and scratching his head. "What became of him?" I asked Tam-Itam. "Twice I struck," he said. When he saw me approaching, he threw himself on the ground and began screaming like a frightened animal, till he felt the point of my spear. Then he stopped moving and lay there, staring at me while his life went out of his eyes. Chapter 7. The Final Verdict. Tam-Itam then went as fast as he could to the town. It was important for him to be the first with the news of the attack and Dane Warris's death. When he arrived, he ran straight to his master, but the first person he met was Jewel coming out of the house. He was exhausted, but told her quickly, "They have killed Dane Warris, and many more." She clapped her hands, and her first words were, "Shut the gates!" She was trembling when she ordered for Jim to be called. Tam-Itam found his master sleeping. "It is I, Tam-Itam," he cried. "This, Tuan, is a day of evil." He began to tell his story to Jim. "Is he dead?" asked Jim. "He ran out after the first shots and was killed." His master walked to the window and with his fist punched the window shutter. Light flooded into the room, and then in a steady voice, but speaking fast, he began to give him orders to follow the pirates. "Forgive me," said Tam-Itam after he had finished, "but it is not safe for your servant to go out onto the street." It was then that Jim understood. The day passed. The girl he loved came to speak to him, but he waved her away and spent his time in loneliness. The dark powers should not rob him twice of his peace. He sat like a stone figure. Later, towards evening, he called for Tam-Itam. "Well?" he asked. "There is much crying and much anger too. We shall have to fight." Tam-Itam replied. "Fight? For what?" "For our lives." There was a cry from the girl outside, and so Tam-Itam left the room, saying, "Who knows, we may still escape." Jewel came in and ordered Jim to fight, but he would not listen. He left the room and walked towards the gates. "Open them," he commanded. The sun was sinking into the forests when Dane Warris's body was brought into Doramin's camp. All of Doramin's men were there with their weapons ready and waiting to see what would happen. 4 men carried the body in, covered with a white sheet. They laid him at Doramin's feet. Dane Warris's body was uncovered at a sign from Doramin. His eyes searched the body from its feet to its head, for the wound perhaps. One of the bystanders took off the ring from the stiff hand, and in silence gave it to Doramin. The old man stared at it, then let out an enormous cry of pain and fury. The women of the household began to cry together. The sun was setting, and between the intervals 2 old men could be heard chanting from the Koran. At about this time, Jim could be found sitting alone and watching the river. Tam-Itam was not far away, waiting patiently to see what would happen. Jewel stood in the doorway of the house. Suddenly, Jim, who had seemed to be lost in thought, turned around and said, "Time to finish this." Tam-Itam didn't know what his master meant. The girl walked down to where Jim was. "Will you fight?" she asked. "There is no escape," he replied. "And you shall go?" she said slowly. "Ah!" she exclaimed. "You are mad or false. Do you remember the night I prayed you to leave me, and you said that you could not, that it was impossible, impossible? Do you remember you said you would never leave me? Why? I asked you for no promise. You promised unasked, remember?" "Enough, poor girl," he said. I would not be worth having. Tam-e-tam said that while they were talking, she laughed out loud and senselessly, like someone possessed. But at one moment she stopped laughing suddenly. For the last time, she cried menacingly, will you defend yourself? Nothing can touch me, he said. Tam-e-tam then watched as she leaned forward where she stood, opened her arms and ran at him quickly. She flung herself upon his breast and held him around the neck. Ah, but I shall hold you like this, she cried. Thou art mine. She cried on his shoulder. The sky over Patusan was blood red, immense. The heavens looked angry and frightful. Suddenly, Jim grabbed her arms, trying to free himself of her. She hung on to him with her head fallen back, her hair touching the ground. Come here, his master called, and Tam-e-tam helped to put her down. It was difficult to release her fingers. Jim, bending over her, looked into her face, and then all at once ran to the river. Tam-e-tam followed him, but turning his head, he saw that she had got to her feet. She ran after them, but then fell over. Tuan, Tuan, called Tam-e-tam. Look back! But Jim was already in a canoe, and he did not look back. Tam-e-tam had just time to get in after him, when the canoe floated away from the river. You are false! She cried out after Jim. Forgive me, he cried. Never, never, she called back. They arrived close to Doramin's camp, when Jim refused to allow his servant to come with him, but loyal Tam-e-tam simply waited a few moments, and then followed him at a distance. Doramin sat in his armchair, desolate, with a pair of pistols on his knees, his men facing him. When Jim appeared, the crowd opened right and left, and he walked up to the great leader. The crying of the women stopped suddenly, but Doramin did not lift his head. Jim walked slowly to the body of his dead friend, lifted the sheet, and then dropped it without saying a word. I have come in sadness. He paused. I have come ready and without weapons. The old man, with help from two of his servants, slowly stood up. The ring which had been in his lap fell onto the floor and rolled against the foot of the white man. Jim looked down at the object, which had been the beginning of his life of fame, love, and success. Doramin stared at him, his little eyes full of pain and rage. He held on to his servant strongly with his left arm, and with his right he raised the pistol and shot his son's friend straight through the chest. Jim, it is said, looked proudly left and right at the crowds of people, and then with his hands over his lips he fell forward, dead. And that is the end. He died, proud, forgotten, unforgiven, and incredibly romantic. And I still think of him. Is his ego satisfied with the end? Some days I remember him as if he were in the same room as me, and on other days he seems like little more than a shadow. The poor girl leads a soundless, inert existence in Stein's house. Stein has aged greatly of late. He feels her pain, and says often that he is preparing to leave all this, preparing to leave, while he waves his hand sadly at his butterflies.